I still remember the day Nayla moved into the house across the narrow, dust-swept street of our suburb. She arrived like a soft breeze in a place that had forgotten how to breathe, her laughter a melody that seemed too bright for the gray stone walls of the house Hendrix had prepared for her. At first, I watched them from my window, a silent observer of what looked like a perfect union, seeing Hendrix carry her over the threshold with a smile that reached his eyes, yet there was something about the way his grip lingered on her arm, a fraction too tight, a second too long, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in silent warning. As the weeks bled into months, that melody I first heard began to sour, turning into a discordant strain of hushed whispers and heavy silences that hung over their veranda like a thick, suffocating fog. I would see Nayla at the market, her head bowed low, the vibrant African prints she used to wear replaced by duller fabrics that seemed designed to make her disappear into the shadows of the stalls. Every time I tried to catch her eye, to offer a simple greeting or a neighborly smile, she would flinch as if my kindness were a physical blow, her hand instinctively flying to her throat or her wrist, covering patches of skin that she hoped I wouldn't notice. Hendrix was always there, hovering like a dark cloud, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder while he spun tales to the village elders about how fragile Nayla's mind had become lately, how she would wake up screaming from nightmares that didn't exist, and how he, the saintly husband, spent his nights soothing a woman who was slowly losing her grip on reality. I watched his performance with a growing sense of dread because I knew that look in a man's eye, the look of a predator who convinces the world the prey is the one who is dangerous. One sweltering Tuesday night, the facade finally cracked for me when the wind carried the unmistakable sound of a heavy thud followed by a stifled sob that echoed through my open shutters, a sound so raw and hollow that it felt like it was tearing through my own chest. I crept to my porch, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I saw Hendrix standing in the golden glow of their doorway, his silhouette imposing and monstrous, while Nayla cowered on the floorboards, her silhouette small and trembling. He wasn't shouting, he was whispering, a low, venomous hiss that was far more terrifying than any scream, telling her that she was nothing without him, that she was a broken vessel, and that if she ever dared to step outside the circle of his control, he would ensure the whole world saw her as the madwoman he was carefully painting her to be. I wanted to run across the street, to pound on their door and scream for justice, but the cold calculation in Hendrix's posture stopped me cold. He was a man who played the long game, a man who had already laid the groundwork for her destruction by poisoning the minds of our neighbors with his lies. I realized then that if I was going to pull Nayla out of that burning house, I couldn't just use my voice, which would be drowned out by his charisma. I needed to become a ghost in his machine, a silent collector of the truths he thought he had buried beneath his mask of devotion. I stayed awake until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, watching their house, listening to the silence that was now filled with the weight of Nayla's hidden bruises, promising myself that I would find a way to break the glass cage he had built around her. The next morning, I saw Hendrix leaving for work, whistling a cheerful tune as if the violence of the night before had been nothing more than a minor chore, and the sheer normalcy of his evil made me realize that this wasn't just a fight for Nayla's safety, it was a war for her soul. I knew I had to get close to her, to find the woman who used to laugh at the market, but I had to do it without Hendrix ever knowing that the girl from across the street was no longer just a neighbor, but a witness who was starting to keep count of every tear shed in the dark. The tension in our small community began to thicken like the humidity before a storm as the weeks progressed and Hendrix intensified his campaign of psychological terror against Nayla. I watched from my vantage point as he started inviting the village elders and even the local doctor over for dinner more frequently, putting on a masterful performance of a man burdened by a spouse's declining mental health. He would sigh deeply, his voice laced with a rehearsed sadness, and tell them how Nayla had started hallucinating or how she had become violent toward him in the middle of the night, all while she sat at the end of the table in a catatonic silence, her spirit so crushed that she didn't even have the strength to deny his claims. One evening, through the thin partition of our shared reality, I heard him shouting at her that the police would never believe a woman who couldn't even remember what she had eaten for breakfast, and it was then that I realized I couldn't wait for her to save herself because he was systematically erasing her identity. I decided to take a massive risk. I used a portion of my savings to buy a small, high-definition recording device that was disguised as a simple decorative brooch, a tiny piece of technology that I knew could be the key to her cage. I waited for a day when Hendrix was preoccupied with a community meeting, and I slipped into their garden where Nayla was hanging laundry with hands that moved like a ghost's, her eyes vacant and staring at nothing. I pulled her into the shade of the large baobab tree and spoke to her with a fierce urgency, telling her that she wasn't crazy and that the things she felt, the pain, the fear, the memory of his hands, were the only true things left in that house. I pressed the brooch into her palm and explained how to activate it, telling her that she needed to record the moments when his mask fell, the moments when the saintly Hendrix turned into the monster who bruised her skin and her soul. She looked at the small object with a mixture of hope and pure, unadulterated terror, her voice shaking as she asked what would happen if he found it, and I told her that if he found it, we would fight together, but if she didn't use it, she would surely die in that house. It took nearly an hour of whispering and crying before she finally tucked the device into the lining of her dress, her fingers trembling as she promised to keep it hidden from his prying eyes and his habit of searching through her things. For the next 3 days, I lived in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every loud noise and watching their front door with a heart that wouldn't stop racing, wondering if I had sent her to her doom or if she would find the courage to click that small button. I saw Hendrix at the gate the following morning, and he tipped his hat to me with a chillingly polite smile, asking if I had noticed Nayla's erratic behavior lately, his eyes searching mine for any sign of suspicion. I forced myself to smile back, playing the role of the gullible neighbor, agreeing that she seemed distant, while inside I was screaming at the injustice of a world that let men like him walk free while women like Nayla were buried alive in their own homes. On the 4th night, I heard the familiar sound of his rage, a low, rhythmic thudding against the wall followed by his voice, cold and sharp as a razor, mocking her for being a madwoman whom no one loves. I stood by my window, my knuckles white as I gripped the sill, praying that she had remembered the brooch, praying that the technology was working and capturing every venomous word that spilled from his lips. The next morning, Nayla came to my door under the guise of returning a cup of sugar, and as she handed me the container, her eyes were burning with a new, dangerous light that I hadn't seen before. Beneath the sugar, hidden at the bottom of the cup, was the brooch, and as our fingers brushed, she whispered a single word, everything, and I knew that the hunt had finally begun. I retreated into my house and plugged the device into my laptop, my breath hitching as the audio files began to load, and as the first recording started to play, the sheer brutality of Hendrix's voice filled my room, stripping away any doubt I might have had about the danger he posed. It wasn't just physical, it was a calculated, methodical destruction of a human being, and as I listened to him admit to faking her medical reports and staging her breakdowns, I knew I held the power to end him. The days that followed were a grueling exercise in patience as I navigated the treacherous waters of being a concerned neighbor without alerting the predatory instincts of Hendrix. I began to orchestrate small, seemingly accidental encounters, waiting for the moments when Hendrix would leave for his job at the timber mill, leaving Nayla trapped in that house which had become her gilded cage. It took weeks of gentle persistence, standing by the fence, sharing a few sprigs of fresh rosemary, or talking about the weather, before she finally allowed me to step into her kitchen, a space that felt strangely cold despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. The air inside their home was heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood and a lingering, metallic tang of fear that Nayla tried to mask with constant cleaning. She scrubbed the counters until her knuckles were raw, her eyes constantly darting toward the front door as if expecting Hendrix to materialize out of the shadows. I sat at her small wooden table, watching her hands tremble as she poured tea, and for the first time, I saw the true extent of the psychological warfare Hendrix was waging. She spoke in fragmented sentences, often stopping mid-thought to correct herself, echoing the very insults I had heard him hiss in the dark. She told me, her voice a mere whisper, that she was forgetful, that she had been falling down the stairs lately because of her clumsiness, and that she was so lucky to have a man like Hendrix who looked after a broken creature like her. It was sickening to hear her internalize his venom, to watch this beautiful African woman believe that her own mind was betraying her when I knew it was his hands that were leaving the marks she so carefully hid under her long sleeves. I reached out and gently took her hand, stopping her frantic movement, and for a split second, the mask of the mad wife slipped, revealing a girl who was drowning and looking for a lifeline. She looked at me with such raw, unadulterated terror that I felt my own breath hitch, and she started to tell me about the episodes Hendrix told the doctor about, how he claimed she would tear her own clothes and scream at ghosts, but as she spoke, she gripped my fingers so hard that I knew she was questioning her own reality. I realized then that Hendrix wasn't just hitting her, he was gaslighting her with a surgical precision that made her doubt her own eyes and ears, creating a narrative of insanity that would protect him from any accusation she might ever dare to make. Every time she tried to seek help from the local council or the village elders, Hendrix would arrive with a look of pained exhaustion, showing them the proof of her instability, perhaps a broken vase or a self-inflicted scratch that he had likely forced her to do or staged himself. The neighborhood began to pity him, whispering about the saintly Hendrix who stayed with a wife who was losing her mind, while Nayla sank deeper into a silent isolation, believing that the world had turned its back on her. I sat there in that kitchen, listening to her recount his lies as if they were gospel, and I knew that if I told her right then that he was a monster, she might pull away out of fear or brainwashed loyalty. I had to be smarter, I had to show her the truth without her feeling attacked, so I started to ask her small, probing questions about the timeline of her accidents, pointing out inconsistencies that her clouded mind hadn't yet processed. I watched a spark of realization flicker in her eyes when I mentioned that the bruise on her shoulder didn't match the shape of the doorframe she supposedly ran into, but the spark was quickly extinguished by the sound of a car engine in the driveway. Nayla practically leaped out of her skin, her face turning a ghostly pale as she hurried me toward the back exit, pleading with her eyes for me to leave before Hendrix found us together. As I slipped through the back gate, I saw Hendrix walking up the front path, his shoulders broad and his face wearing that practiced mask of a hard-working, grieving husband, and I felt a cold fire ignite in my belly. He thought he had won because he had convinced everyone that Nayla was crazy, but he didn't realize that I was now an anchor for her drifting sanity, and I was going to start collecting the pieces of the truth he was trying so hard to shatter. I went back to my house and sat in the dark, my mind racing with ways to capture the reality of what happened inside those four walls, knowing that words would never be enough to take down a man who had the whole community in the palm of his hand. I needed something undeniable, something that would strip away his charisma and show the world the jagged, ugly heart of the man who called himself her protector. Listening to those recordings felt like plunging my soul into a vat of ice water because the Hendrix I heard on the tape was a demon that the village elders would never have recognized. The audio was chillingly clear, capturing the sound of his heavy footsteps approaching her, the sickening slap of his hand against her face, and then that calm, haunting voice of his telling her that she was a filthy, broken thing that he was doing a favor by keeping. My hands shook so violently that I had to grip the edge of my desk to stay upright as I heard him laugh about how easy it had been to bribe the clinic clerk to change her records, ensuring that any doctor she saw would see a history of hysteria rather than a history of trauma. I realized then that I couldn't just take this to the local police station because Hendrix had friends there. He played cards with the sergeant and helped the inspector with his taxes, so any move I made had to be outside his circle of influence. I spent the next few hours copying the files onto multiple flash drives, hiding them in various places around my house, inside an old flour sack, tucked behind the lining of a suitcase, and even buried in a small plastic jar in my garden, because I knew that if Hendrix suspected I had this evidence, my life would be as forfeit as Nayla's. I spent the rest of the day watching their house, my heart leaping into my throat every time I saw his shadow pass by the window, wondering if he could smell the betrayal on the air or see the defiance in the way I no longer looked away when he glanced toward my porch. Nayla appeared at her window briefly, her face a mask of exhaustion, but for the first time, there was a secret understanding between us, a silent pact that the chains were starting to rust. I knew the next step was the most dangerous because I needed to find the actual physical evidence of his fraud, the forged medical papers or the receipts for the bribes, and that meant someone had to get into that house while he was in it, or while he was distracted enough to leave his study unlocked. I began to track his movements with the precision of a hunter, noting that every Friday he went to the outskirts of town for a long meeting with the timber contractors, leaving a window of exactly 2 hours where the house was less guarded, though he usually locked the internal doors. I shared this plan with Nayla through a series of notes hidden in the laundry we both hung out to dry, my heart pounding as I watched her read my instructions to leave the back pantry window unlatched on the coming Friday. She was terrified, her handwriting on the return note shaky and smudged with tears, telling me that he had started sleeping with his keys under his pillow and that he had grown even more suspicious of her every move. Despite her fear, she agreed, knowing that this was our only chance to turn the madwoman narrative back on the man who had authored it, and as Friday approached, the air in our neighborhood felt thick and electrified. I prepared a small kit, a flashlight, a camera, and a pair of gloves, feeling like a criminal myself, yet the thought of Nayla's bruised ribs and shattered dignity gave me a cold, hard resolve that outweighed my terror. When Friday afternoon finally arrived and I saw Hendrix's truck rumble down the dirt road and disappear around the bend, I didn't hesitate. I slipped through the tall grass of my backyard and over the low stone wall, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I reached the back pantry window and pushed. It groaned slightly but swung open, and I tumbled into the dim, cool interior of their house, a place that felt like a tomb dedicated to the ego of a monster. I made my way toward his study, my pulse roaring in my ears like a waterfall, knowing that at any moment he could forget something and turn that truck around, catching me in the act of unmasking his life's work of deception. The door to the study was heavy oak, and as I turned the handle, I prayed to every ancestor I knew for the strength to find what was hidden before the clock ran out and the hunter returned to his lair. Inside the study, the air felt thin and smelled of old paper and the bitter tobacco Hendrix favored, a scent that now made my stomach churn with a violent revulsion. I began to sift through the mahogany desk, my gloved fingers moving with a frantic but careful precision, knowing that a single misplaced paper could alert him to my presence and seal both my fate and Nayla's. I searched through drawers filled with mundane receipts and property deeds, feeling a rising sense of panic as the minutes ticked away on my watch, until I noticed a small, inconspicuous floorboard slightly raised beneath the heavy rug under his chair. I shoved the furniture aside with a strength born of desperation and pried the board up, revealing a metal lockbox that seemed to hold the weight of all his secrets. My heart was thundering so loudly against my ribs that I almost missed the sound of a distant engine, a low rumble that sent a jolt of pure electricity through my limbs, but I forced myself to stay focused as I used a small pick to pop the simple lock. Inside were the trophies of his cruelty, the original, unaltered medical reports from the city hospital showing Nayla was in perfect health, alongside a notebook where he had meticulously logged the dates he had medicated her food to make her appear drowsy and confused in front of visitors. There were also copies of the letters he had forged in her handwriting, addressed to her family in the distant hills, claiming she was losing her mind and didn't want them to visit anymore. It was a manual of destruction, a cold-blooded blueprint of how to erase a woman's life without ever leaving a mark the law would normally care about. I took my camera and began photographing every single page, my hand steadying as the evidence piled up in digital form, capturing the undeniable proof that would turn the village's saint into a social pariah. Just as I was snapping the final picture of a bribe receipt to a local officer, the sound of the truck grew louder, the gravel of the driveway crunching under heavy tires, and I realized Hendrix had returned an hour earlier than expected. Panic seized my throat like a cold hand, but I forced myself to replace the papers, shut the lockbox, and slide the floorboard back into place with the rug smoothed over it just as I heard the heavy thud of the truck door closing. I scrambled toward the pantry window, my chest heaving, but as I reached the kitchen, I saw Nayla standing there, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to drain the color from the room. She pointed toward the front door, her voice a broken thread of a whisper, telling me there was no time to get out the back without him seeing me through the side gate. I had to hide, so she shoved me into the narrow, dark space of the broom closet just as the front door swung open with a bang that echoed like a gunshot in the silent house. I peered through the narrow slats of the closet door, my breath held until my lungs burned, watching Hendrix walk into the kitchen with a dark scowl on his face, his presence filling the room with an oppressive, suffocating heat. He grabbed Nayla by the jaw, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he demanded to know why the back window was unlatched, accusing her of trying to escape or bring someone into his sanctuary. I watched in agonizing silence as he pushed her against the counter, his shadow looming over her like a dark god, and for a moment, I thought I would have to burst out and face him with my bare hands just to stop him from hurting her. But Nayla, with a courage I didn't know she still possessed, looked him in the eye and lied, claiming the latch was old and must have slipped, her voice steady even as a tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Hendrix stared at her for what felt like an eternity, his eyes searching for a crack in her armor, before he spat on the floor and walked toward his study, leaving us both trembling in the wake of his malice. I waited in that dark closet for 2 agonizing hours, listening to the clink of his glass and the heavy silence of the house, until I finally heard him go upstairs to shower. Nayla sprinted to the closet, her face a mask of desperation, and practically threw me out the back door, her eyes pleading with me to go and never come back without the power to end this nightmare for good. As I ran through the tall grass toward the safety of my own home, clutching the camera to my chest like a holy relic, I knew the time for hiding was over. I had the truth, and now I had to find a way to make the world listen before Hendrix realized his secrets were no longer his alone. The adrenaline from the escape was still coursing through my veins, making my skin itch and my thoughts race as I sat in my darkened living room, the camera's memory card feeling like a hot coal in my hand. I knew that I couldn't go to the local authorities yet because the receipt I had photographed confirmed that Hendrix had the deputy in his pocket, a betrayal of public trust that made my blood boil with a cold, focused fury. I spent the entire night drafting a detailed chronological report, meticulously linking the audio recordings of his verbal abuse to the photographs of the forged medical documents and the notebook entries where he admitted to drugging Nayla's meals. My plan was to bypass our local jurisdiction entirely and take the evidence to the regional capital's High Court and the Internal Affairs Division of the National Police, but I needed a way to get Nayla out of that house before I made my move, because once Hendrix realized he was cornered, he would become a cornered animal, capable of anything. The next morning, I saw Hendrix leave in a state of agitation, his usual calm facade replaced by a frantic, jagged energy that told me he was starting to suspect something was wrong, perhaps noticing a hair out of place in his study or a slight shift in the dust on his lockbox. I waited until his truck disappeared over the ridge and then I ran to the fence, calling for Nayla with a low, urgent whistle that we had established as our secret signal for an emergency. She came to the porch, her movements stiff and pained, and I saw a fresh purple bloom of a bruise ripening on her cheekbone, a grim reminder that our time was rapidly running out. I told her through the wire mesh that I had everything, the photos, the recordings, and the proof of his bribes, and that she needed to pack a small bag of essentials and hide it in the bushes by the back gate, for tonight was the night we would make our break for the city. She looked at me with a terrifying mix of hope and paralyzing doubt, whispering that he had taken her passport and locked it in the wall safe, but I told her to forget the documents and just bring herself, because her life was the only thing that couldn't be replaced. I spent the afternoon arranging a private car through a cousin I trusted, someone who didn't know Hendrix and couldn't be bought by his charm or his money, setting the meeting point at the old bridge 3 miles out of town. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood reds, the atmosphere in our street became suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. I watched Hendrix return home earlier than usual, and my heart sank as I saw him skip the usual pleasantries with the neighbors and head straight inside, slamming the door with a force that rattled my own windows. From my porch, I could hear the muffled sounds of an argument starting, the low rumble of his voice escalating into a roar of accusations, and I realized with a jolt of horror that he must have found the brooch or noticed the tampering in his study. I didn't wait for a signal, I grabbed my bag and the flash drives, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my chest, and I sprinted toward their back door just as a piercing scream tore through the evening air. I burst into their kitchen and saw Hendrix standing over Nayla, his hand tangled in her hair as he brandished the small recording device I had given her, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated evil. He turned his gaze toward me, his eyes wide with a manic realization that I was the one who had breached his sanctuary, and for a moment, the air between us was electric with the promise of violence. He let go of Nayla and started toward me, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, but I stood my ground and held up my phone, playing the recording of his own voice admitting to the fraud at full volume. The sound of his own confession echoing in the small kitchen froze him in his tracks, the shock of hearing his secrets played back to him, giving Nayla the second she needed to scramble to her feet and grab a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. She didn't hesitate, swinging with every ounce of the rage and pain she had suppressed for years, the blow catching him squarely on the temple and sending him crashing to the floor in a heap of broken pride and expensive clothes. We didn't stop to see if he was conscious. I grabbed Nayla's hand, her palm sweaty and shaking in mine, and we fled out the back door into the deepening shadows of the night. We ran through the high grass and the tangled brush of the outskirts, our breath coming in ragged, desperate sobs, the fear of his footsteps behind us driving us forward even as our muscles screamed for relief. We reached the bridge just as the headlights of my cousin's car cut through the darkness, and as we scrambled into the back seat and the engine roared to life, I looked back at the receding lights of our village, knowing that the madwoman and her neighbor had just set fire to the world Hendrix thought he owned. The drive to the capital was a blur of shadows and silence, the hum of the tires on the asphalt the only sound as Nayla sat huddled against the car door, her eyes fixed on the retreating darkness of the life she was leaving behind. I clutched the bag containing the flash drives to my lap, feeling the weight of the evidence like a physical shield, knowing that as long as those files existed, Hendrix's power was a crumbling ruin. We reached the regional police headquarters just as the first gray light of dawn began to wash over the city's concrete skyline, a stark and cold contrast to the warm, dusty village that had been our prison. I walked into the station with Nayla leaning on my shoulder, her body trembling with a delayed shock, and I demanded to speak directly to the Internal Affairs commander, refusing to hand over a single piece of information to the desk officers who might still be within the reach of Hendrix's influence. It took hours of waiting in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room before a high-ranking officer with sharp, skeptical eyes sat across from us, but the moment I pressed play on the recording and spread the photographs of the forged documents across the table, the air in the room shifted from suspicion to a grim, professional urgency. I watched the officer's face harden as he heard Hendrix's cold voice bragging about bribing the local deputy, and I knew then that we had finally bypassed the wall of silence that had protected the monster for so long. While Nayla gave her formal statement, her voice growing stronger and more certain with every sentence, a tactical unit was already being dispatched to our village to intercept Hendrix before he could flee or destroy any remaining evidence in the house. The wait for news was an agonizing stretch of hours spent in a safe house provided by a women's advocacy group, where for the first time in years, I saw Nayla eat a meal without flinching at the sound of a closing door or a raised voice. Late that evening, the call finally came through. Hendrix had been apprehended while trying to cross the border, his truck loaded with the very documents I had photographed, and the local deputy who had taken his money was already in handcuffs, singing like a bird to save his own skin. The news hit us like a tidal wave of relief, and Nayla collapsed into my arms, weeping not with the hollow sorrow of the victim she had been, but with the raw, cleansing tears of a woman who had finally reclaimed her name and her sanity. In the weeks that followed, the trial became a national sensation, a landmark case that exposed the terrifying ease with which a manipulative man could use the label of madness to silence a woman's cry for justice. I stood in that courtroom and looked Hendrix in the eye as I testified, watching the mask of the charming, grieving husband melt away to reveal the pathetic, hollow coward underneath, a man who was nothing without the fear he instilled in others. The judge's sentence was a harsh and righteous vindication, ensuring that Hendrix would spend the better part of his life behind bars, far away from the woman he had tried to erase. Today, I sit on my veranda and look across the street at the house that used to be a tomb. It is empty now, the weeds growing over the path where he once walked with such arrogance, but the air in our neighborhood finally feels clean. Nayla moved to the city to start a new life, her laughter now a frequent sound over the phone, a vibrant and healthy melody that no longer has to hide in the shadows of a whisper. I often think about the night we ran through the grass, two women against a system designed to fail us, and I realize that the greatest weapon we ever had wasn't the camera or the recordings, but the simple, unshakable truth that we were never alone. I am no longer just a neighbor who watched from a window, I am a witness to the power of a shared silence broken, and as I watch the sun set over our quiet street, I know that the Gunji Hui Kamoshi, the echoing silence, has finally been filled with the roar of justice.